Hello, my name's Laura Lear and welcome to the Thoughtful Leadership Podcast from Ambitious. Did you know that the World Economic Forum said that it would take 117 years for us to close the gender pay gap? Well, my guest today is an absolute expert on this topic. Her roots stem in human rights, which she is passionate about, and she's paired this with data to focus on this topic and to solve the problem through an organisation called Gapsquare, which she founded around 5 years ago. She's since moved on and she is now working and leading an organisation called WorkVue, which is all around the jobless future and how we can prepare for that. So I'm delighted to have with me today Zara Nanu. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I'd love to start from the beginning because I know you're passionate about this topic and I know a lot of it stems from childhood and human rights focus and campaigning. Could you tell us a bit about that kind of passion and where that came from?
Yeah, so I was passionate about women's rights for a very long time, and I think it comes from this long line of women, strong women in employment and primarily in education, but that kind of having that at home and in the family was always an inspiration. So I knew that I was going to do something perhaps related to education, but a lot of it related to girls and women's education and empowerment. It so happens that actually ended up being very much focused on women's economic empowerment, which I'm very happy about, because you are absolutely right. The World Economic Forum now says 170 years, whereas in 2015, when I founded Gapsquare, they were saying we were 217 years away from achieving gender parity in general between men and women.
Wow.
And at the same time, they were telling us by 2030, most of us will be in self-driving cars, moving around without having to drive. And by 2030, hospitals won't exist in the form that we know them today, because a lot of the care will happen at home and a lot of the tech will provide that care at home. NASA's telling us by 2030 we will actually see people fly off to Mars. And yet when we're there in 2030 in our self-driving cars waving those people off to Mars, we would still be 200 years away from achieving parity between men and women. And I just couldn't bear the thought of that and think, how is it that we're using innovation and data and tech to accelerate so many other things in our society, but we're not using it to accelerate equality? And I was really passionate about doing something about it.
And so this obviously led you to found Gapsquare. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the challenges of founding an organisation and also being a female leader? I'd love to explore that a little bit. And I know, those startup mode is very different from the kind of the corporate larger organisation in terms of challenges and what you have to deal with as a leader.
Yeah, so in 2015, I founded Gapsquare together with my co-founder, and we really wanted to look and explore how we can utilize data and help companies understand if they have gaps, why they have those gaps, what is there anything that justifies those gaps, like perhaps educational background, types of roles, anything that is a pay determining or career progression determining characteristic. And then close the gaps that aren't justified, because at the end of the day, they are illegal. And I think there are a few definitions floating around when we talk about gender gaps in the workplace. So we have the leadership gap, we have equal pay gaps. Equal pay gaps are the illegal ones. You can't pay people different salaries for doing the same job and the same work. Most recently, that has started to expand into equal pay for equal value. We've seen some cases in supermarkets. Next, as a retailer, has been the most recent one, where women at the checkouts were being paid differently than the people in the warehouses. The people in the warehouses were predominantly men. They were receiving higher wages per hour, and the women challenged that, saying that they bring the same value to the company. In terms of, we're talking about very low paid jobs ultimately in our economies, but there was still that discrepancy. And the employment court decided that, yes, they bring the same value. So the Next now has to pay similar wages to the women at the checkouts and the men in the warehouses. So it's the equal pay piece. And then there's the gender pay gap piece. The gender pay gap piece is about looking at averages. So within an organization of, say, 100 or 200,000, 10,000 people, you look at what does the average man earn compared to the average woman. In the UK, that gap for full-time employment is at around 13%. If you just look at any kind of employment, it jumps up a bit to about 17-18%. Depending on the industry, it can go as high as 30%. And those averages reflect, actually, lack of women in leadership roles. They reflect the clustering of women in occupations that pay less. And they also reflect something known as the motherhood penalty, where women take career breaks to care for children or to care for elderly parents later in their careers, and then that has a big impact on them. So I wanted to bring some clarity to all of these definitions within organizations with the help of data, and just help them clearly see where the gaps are, why they're there, how they can take data-driven decisions to narrow those gaps. And I thought it was going to be an easy job, but couldn't be further from the truth. One, because it's really difficult to be a woman in tech. It's a very male-dominated environment. A lot of the funding that is in the tech space goes to male founders. You're very kind of typical white, young, right, Patagonia vest kind of California guy who gets the funding to develop tech. Every year there's still reports. So from 2015 when I started until now, every year we hear the same thing. 2% of VC funding goes to female founders.
And that's still the same. So there's been no major improvement.
The same, no improvement at all. And it's significantly less when we talk about women of color. It is 0.002% in terms of the funding that they get. There was a report actually last week in The Guardian where femtech, which is tech for women, a lot of it is health related, has the same issue. You are less likely to get funding for a femtech company if you're a woman.
And it's a female product.
Yes.
Wow.
So it's that challenging. You are even less likely to get money if somehow in your company somewhere someone reads women's rights as a descriptor of what you do. So the kind of the context is challenging.
Where do we sit alongside other countries? Are we behind? Is there a kind of a golden country who seems to have it right yet?
I think we're kind of on par with Europe. So the Atomico report, which every year does the statistics and tells us about the 2% funding for women-led companies, that is European. Things are slightly better when it comes to the US, but overall things are better when it comes to the US in terms of investment in general. There's more money. People are less risk averse. There's more money being invested around in the US. And we're seeing a lot of change and faster progress in Scandinavian countries as well.
So we've moved forward a little bit, but not far enough. And how are we going to be able to shift the dial even further and faster?
So I still think data is key. What gets measured gets done, and you can't hide. A lot of the times we talk to companies and they say we don't have a gender gap. If you want to be a leader in our organization, you can be a leader. And then they look at their data and understand that actually there are pockets that create significant barriers for women to even progress into middle management, not to mention senior leadership. So that data is key, but I think data on its own can be quite dry and unengaging. So storytelling as well, and really promoting and talking about stories of women who run companies, women who started tech businesses and have been successful. So really data and that storytelling can help us move forward.
No, absolutely. And there's obviously a lot around that in terms of childcare, isn't there? And empowering mothers to go back to work. And I know there's a lot of conversation and a lot of organisations campaigning around that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually I think we also forget, but last year, Claudia Goldin won the Nobel Prize in economics specifically for research around the gender gap. And she's focused a lot of her time looking at the motherhood penalty and women and careers and family and careers. And one of her kind of the little piece of research that really stuck with me is around greedy jobs. So what she says is that as you climb on the career ladder and you get more into more leadership, senior management roles, those jobs become very greedy in terms of time. And she's saying that you can't have two people in the same household have greedy jobs. If you want to have a family, if you want to have children, if you want to kind of work in the community and be embedded in your community and have friends and have a life outside of work, you can't have two people have greedy jobs. And we have to really take that into account. And a lot of the conversations that speak to that are talking about, how do we get women to spend more time in these greedy jobs? How do we bring more women in STEM? How do we raise more women in leadership? But the conversation actually needs to be about how do we degrade those jobs, because that's what's going to help us get a diverse pool of talent into those jobs. How do we make them less greedy? Why do we need people to work 60 hours a week?
And how did you put all of this to practice in terms of Gapsquare and obviously founding a business? I'm interested in your own experience in terms of being a leader and, thoughtful leadership. In your words, what does that mean?
So there were a few things that we did. One was that we were really focused on growing leaders within our own organization. I was very aware of the fact that we need a team of leaders who are self-sufficient, and whatever they do after Gapsquare, they can really shine and thrive. So that was always a focus for the company. In terms of funding, we've tried to raise money so we can grow and we can scale. And I can safely say I've probably pitched 100 times to VCs in the UK and some of them in Europe. Never got a single pound out of those pitches. But that has always motivated me to really push forward. And what we've done is we've grown a business based on commercializing our product and getting customers, which is the best way to grow a business. Actually, you drive revenue. This is what a business is there for. It was really interesting. In addition to not really getting the funding, we were having conversations with journalists. And I remember in the early days, this conversation with a journalist from the Financial Times who said, why is this a business? This is a charitable, closing the gender pay gap should be a charitable endeavor. You should be doing this for free for companies. And I thought, no, if companies are serious about closing the gender gap, they should really put their money where their mouth is and really invest in this. Unless they invest in this and only see this as a charitable action, nothing's really going to happen.
It's interesting. We were speaking to someone a few weeks ago, and one of the stats he provided was that actually social enterprise impact businesses actually pump 60 billion into the economy. Yeah. And actually the importance of those businesses that have a real core purpose, because obviously the challenge is a lot of businesses don't have purpose at their core and they're trying to create purpose, but actually what you have is a very clear purpose and mission in terms of what you want to achieve.
Yeah, it's been very interesting from that point of view. And it's interesting that Gapsquare was always clustered as tech for good. And I always had a challenge with that, because if this is tech for good, what is the rest of tech? Tech for bad? Is that how we're clustering? Shouldn't all tech be tech for good? Why else are we developing it?
Absolutely. It's that shift, isn't it, in mindset. And talk a bit about, it'd be great to hear from you, I think, around the sort of startup, scrappy business period through to CEO of a kind of larger, more established organisation. What are the differences?
There weren't necessarily that many differences, because with Gapsquare, we started with 0 people and we grew it to about 11 by the time we sold the business to Relics, which is a FTSE 100. And that's when actually the bigger piece came in. But I think the main difference was that when we were a smaller organization, we were able to really prioritize our people and prioritize giving people opportunities to be leaders and to lead in what they do. And that really worked for us. It always meant 100% delivery from people. We never expected anyone to work beyond their working hours. We never expected people to, work from holiday and answer their emails at midnight. When we became part of a larger corporation, the leadership piece was a little bit different, because there were a lot of processes in place and hierarchies in place that really kind of shook that to the core. And I think that's a lot of our people were a bit challenged by that, because when you're in an organization and you're empowered and you know that you can take your own decisions because you're trusted, and suddenly you're part of a process where you can't take decisions because someone else needs to do that decision. It's very different.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. We work with various businesses, smaller and larger corporates, and you can see that, and that sort of the growth trajectory and the various different, stages through that growth and how businesses do change. How do you empower the next generation of female leaders? How do we get them kind of engaged and thinking about the roles that they can play in today's world as leaders?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a little bit, this cuts into a little bit of what I'm trying to do now. So I've left Gapsquare. So I sold Gapsquare to Relics. It's been integrated in the business, and I left last year so that I can start a new company called WorkVue. And what I want to do is use data to empower the people in work, or people who want to work, the younger generations who are looking at what's in it for me when I go to into the world of work. And it's built on the premise that I think the future of work is going to look very different from what the current working landscape looks like. OECD is already telling us that in professional roles, a lot of those will be done in a portfolio kind of way by 2030, and that's very soon. And people will be doing a lot of project-based work rather than role-based work. And we have AI and automation, so that's changing the landscape. And I think there's an opportunity here for us to really create and foster more equality through that. We can highlight stories about women in business, women in leadership roles, women who are at the heart of their communities, because it's absolutely true. If you can see it, you can be it. And when women don't see other women in tech, young women in particular, it's really hard for them to imagine themselves in those industries. So it's about kind of empowering the younger generations with data, but also with stories about women who are successful and can be successful in that space.
And it's interesting, another topic that has come up is around this sort of the equity piece, and obviously we don't want to disempower our young men, and obviously there's conversation around that. What's your take on that kind of discussion?
I mean, it really it would take all of us to move the needle on equality, and we can't leave men behind. We're already seeing that reports are coming out where women are a lot more progressive in terms of their outlook on life and the future, and we're seeing men become, especially young men become more conservative in terms of their outlook on life. So that's a serious issue we need to address, because if men's perspective is that things have gone too far in terms of equality, isn't going to be addressed or challenged or taken into account, we're not going to be able to make progress on this.
When it comes to kind of purpose in business, obviously it's at the core. Do you think that's absolutely crucial to the business world? Do you think that is the key to a leader in a business, whether it's a purpose-centric business or not? Do you think that has to be the future for leadership in terms of like driving business forward?
I think so. So I have two young girls. One of them is 16 and the other one is 12. And they are increasingly, and their generation is looking at doing the right thing and making sure things are fair, more so than I think previous generations. And I think we have more and more of these young people coming into employment expecting that the leaders will want to nurture them into leaders, but also can help them find fulfillment in work and can find that fulfillment through that purpose and through connecting to the why. And we kind of, there was a big movement when Simon Sinek came up with the why theory. Everyone kind of rode that wave, and I think it kind of has died down, but actually there's a lot of truth to that. The why, the why will drive why people wake up in the morning and want to go to work and want to be leaders and want to show an example for others. Yeah,
and finding your own purpose as well as working for an organisation that has clear purpose. And it's certainly a recruitment strategy as well, isn't it, for businesses in terms of, people, as you say, want to work for a purpose-led business that has more meaning in their lives. And what, if you're looking ahead in sort of 10, 15 years, hopefully more female leaders as well, and more equality, what the leadership's changed in such a big way. And I'm talking about leadership broadly, from 15, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and it was very hierarchical in its approach, and you had lots of layers in an organisation. How do you think that will have shifted? And, what is the key attributes of a great leader?
A great leader is someone who has empathy and someone who really clicks and connects with the stakeholders around them and really kind of works together and alongside everyone else, not in a top-down kind of approach. And this is bound to change with the advancement in tech, AI and automation. We're already seeing how jobs are being changed, how those kind of middle management leaders in organizations are currently being replaced by a lot of pieces of software that can help automate that kind of top-down approach of these are the tasks that you need to do. So leadership is more about empowering, is more about empathy, emotional intelligence, really connecting and communicating with people, empowering them, creating energy, so that people feel really excited and passionate about what they're doing. And I think that's changing the dynamic of what leaders look like and should look like, giving an opportunity for more women to step into those roles.
And I mean, how do you balance that with profit as well? Because that's obviously always one of the biggest challenges, isn't it, for business, which, as you say, you need to be able to grow and profit alongside the people and the planet piece as well, which is obviously, crucially important. How do you balance those three?
Yeah, I think we've been going through a period of time where, especially in the tech space, profit is a big part of it, and significant growth, that hockey stick growth is at the heart of it. And more women in leadership can help us reconsider that, because that hockey stick growth isn't great at all times. When we talk about tech companies, it's easy to forget the environmental impact of all those data servers and the emails that we send and everything else. It's the environmental impact of that is quite big. So doing it sustainably and doing that growth in a mindful way, and not do growth for growth's sake, but do growth because it's important for people, for the planet, for our future.
Yeah, was that a big consideration with both of the organisations that you've sort of founded? In terms of obviously being data-led, was that a big part of it?
That was always a big part of what we were thinking about. Because like I said, it's really easy to forget. And it's not something that I immediately thought about, because you think, okay, we're paperless, therefore we are saving the world and we're saving trees. But actually, the data servers are having an even bigger impact on carbon emissions than if we would have sent a letter by post. So we don't naturally think about that, but we tried to do increasingly more of that thinking with Gapsquare.
And I know that you spend a time abroad and you're on various different boards. So the Harvard Women in Leadership Board. What's that? What's the aim there? What's the focus of that sort of forum?
Yeah, so I am very fortunate, and I really enjoy being part of Harvard Women's Leadership Board. It's one of my favorite, and we convene twice a year and we discuss issues important for women's rights around the world, from women in Ukraine to advancement of AI to women in democracy and in politics. So all of these issues, it's a platform for us to convene a group of women from all over the world, talk about these issues, learn more from different policy and academic research in Harvard, and then take that and execute it through the different ways that we operate. So it's a very exciting group of women, and it's very inspiring. It's inspiring to go and be surrounded by other women leaders who feel like giants in their industry and think, they're great role models.
And are there particular sectors that you think? I know that we talked about, finance and often tech is seen as has been more male-centric in the past. Are there particular industries that are sort of very female-forward?
There are, but they're usually the lower paid sectors. So the care sector really jumps to mind because it's very female dominated, it's very low paid, and the impact of tech and automation isn't currently making their lives easier or helping them get better pay and a better quality of life. So the care sector is just an example of a lot of other kind of lower paid sectors that have a lot of women, and those jobs aren't at risk of automation. Or AI, and aren't kind of at the forefront of some kind of insane growth that's going to result in their wages going up and their careers suddenly becoming better. So if we don't do something about it, we risk creating an economy where we have a lot of men in tech jobs and being paid very high roles, and a lot of women in care roles being paid the living wage.
And that's still a real risk, is it? Do you see that in terms of that segmentation and where we are on that journey?
Absolutely, yeah.
So what more can be done? So back on the gender pay gap, and I know it's a complex area and you mentioned several different aspects, but what more can be done? Do we need more focus? Because I know probably 2-3 years ago it was a big issue on the news, gender pay gap. Do we need to highlight it more? Do we need to be focusing on that equality more in business and in society?
We absolutely need to focus more on diversity and inclusion and more women in leadership. And I think it comes and goes in waves. The gender pay gap legislation was great because it really put that on the agenda for the UK. But by now, it kind of the wider population got a bit desensitized to this conversation. Yes, we have a gender pay gap. Yes, it's 17%. It was still 17% last year. So you get desensitized to it and you start accepting it as a norm. Whereas what we have to do is use that data to challenge and really unpick a few key issues. And I think occupational segregation right now is an important one to unpick. And occupational segregation is exactly that, the clustering of men and women in different types of occupations. The ones where there are more men pay higher, the ones where there are more women pay significantly less.
I would love to just ask a few, kind of get a bit of advice from you to any of our listeners really around kind of, if they are looking to start up a business or very much looking at kind of taking on a leadership role, what are the key things they need to focus on? What do you think are the key attributes that they should be thinking about developing in themselves?
Yeah, so I think the main one is staying true to yourself, because if you stay true to yourself, it's the only way you would be able to enjoy what you're doing. I was once at a pitching event, and after I pitched and I went backstage, someone came up to me and said, you should perhaps wear trouser suits, because if you look at everyone else who's pitching, coming up on stage in a dress sends confusing messages to the investors. And I thought that is ridiculous, and I did not do that. So staying true to yourself and who you are is really important.
And being authentic.
Yeah.
So what's next? WorkVue obviously is a big focus of yours. Have you got any other grand plans or focus areas that you're looking to kind of sort of champion over the next few years?
So the main thing that I want to do is continue to focus on helping close the gender pay gap. And through WorkVue, I want to democratize data around pay, make data about pay, skills, future of work more accessible to anyone who works, women in particular. And I'd like to look at how we can utilize the data that we have about jobs to deconstruct them a bit and try and understand why is it that we pay a software engineer an X amount and a home care worker another amount, so that we can bring some logic into it, because right now there isn't any logic in it except some market-driven supply and demand indicators that we've used to set pay. So I'd like to focus on kind of how do we deconstruct that, reassign value to some of the skills that we bring in the workplace, some of the leadership abilities that we bring into the workplace, so that we can equalize pay a little bit more.
And presumably this needs government support ultimately to actually really achieve kind of a shift. Is that something we're able to achieve? Are there conversations going on directly?
There are so interestingly enough, there are some conversations that are happening at government levels about the future of work, about where it's all going. A lot of them from looking at pay and public sector pay all the way to looking at setting some kind of universal basic income in the future so that can cover people's wages. But we do need to bring policymakers into this conversation. And so far, policy has been lagging behind tech. We really need to make sure that accelerates, not just in tech in general and kind of the ethics of AI, but anything else that we develop with the help and use of tech.
And hopefully, as you say, with the new businesses coming on, the new leaders, this will be a priority moving forward. And I think one of the conversations we had, the small businesses do make up 99.5% of the business world. And actually, if we've got purpose-led leaders coming through who are really focused on equality and diversity, we'll see that shift.
Yeah, and a lot of those small businesses are actually women-led. It's just stories that we don't hear about and numbers that we don't really proliferate and when we hear things on the news. So it's really important to capitalize on that.
And how do we encourage more of the funding? Because that seems to be the real challenge, doesn't it? You mentioned the VC funding and very few female-led organisations acquiring that funding.
Yeah.
How do we change and shift that mindset?
I think so. I'm a part of different groups that are female founder groups that look at this question, and the one that I've enjoyed the most is where female founders come together to back and fund each other's businesses and identify through their networks other people who will. I think the VC community isn't necessarily fit for purpose when it comes to funding women-led businesses. A lot of women-led businesses are impactful businesses. They kind of prioritize impact. They prioritize making the world a better place. And a lot of investors see that as second-hand to prioritizing those profits and that hockey stick growth. So we just need to look at alternative ways of funding until the VC community really wakes up to the fact that they could have bigger returns and they could have better impact if they included women in their considerations. And a lot of the times the conversation is around pipeline. VCs say, oh, there isn't a pipeline. Like out of so many pitches that I see a week, only one is a female founder. But it's not because they aren't there. It's because they don't get to that VC, and that VC isn't doing enough outreach to make sure that they reach the communities, that they reach the women that they want to invest in.
Well, it's been so interesting talking to you today. I have one final question for you. And I'm asking all my guests this. So if you were walking in as a CEO of a new organisation tomorrow, it could be a small or large organisation, what would be your first agenda point that you would want to raise or understand?
I think I would do something along the lines of listening to people and their experiences in the organisation. So some kind of big listening exercise. I really believe in the leadership's primary role being listening rather than solving people's problems. It's like parenting. The main challenge that I have is actually finding the time to listen. They will find their own solutions to the problems as long as they can talk to someone about them. So it's the same in leadership. A lot of the people aren't looking for solutions. They're looking for someone to listen to their challenges.
Well, thank you. It's been so great to chat to you today.
Thank you so much, Laura.